turn. In a moment, I'm going to be talking about why this is an important symbol for us. But in the meantime, I'm going to set it right here. I'll put it so you don't have to look at it. There we go. Oh, there it goes. Okay, today is Transfiguration Sunday, as well as Scout Sunday. Last Sunday before Lent begins. And as I was preparing for this day, there was a particular phrase from the gospel lesson that I just could not get out of my mind. It was, "Teacher, I beg you, look at my son. He is my only child." And my attention just kept being drawn to that desperate father saying, "Teacher, I beg you, look at my son. He is my only child." Now there's many themes, potentially, in today's gospel lesson. And if it hadn't been for that cry of that desperate father, I might have gone with one of the other themes. For example, one particular commentator says that our theme today should be on silence. Because in the gospel lesson, after the disciples have heard the voice of God, they are silent. And this particular commentator said that the only appropriate response to the Transfiguration or to hearing God speak to us, at least initially, is silent reverence. And because we so avoid silence, we miss that kind of communication with the divine. Well, I think that's a good point. But Jesus, "Teacher, I beg you, look at my son. He is my only child." Another commentator said our focus should be on prayer, since Jesus was going up on the mountain to pray when he was transfigured. And so we should talk about the importance of prayer, which it is important. But Jesus, I beg you, look at my only son. He is my only child. And then my favorite, and this one I was really tempted because this one fits for Scout Sunday. One commentator said we should talk about the trek up the mountain, the hike up to the mountaintop that Jesus and the disciples had to take, and that we should see it as a metaphor for our approaching God. In other words, our life of faith, our life is a journey like climbing a mountain. And there's many treacherous paths, there's pitfalls, but there's also glorious vistas that we can see. Now I like that one because I figured I could talk about Boy Scouts out on hikes, but also because I had just read a book where a woman hiked over 1,000 miles. What a bunch of great illustrations. And yet, those words, "Jesus, I beg you, look at my son. He is my only child." I just could not get away from that. And I think that's because where the rubber hits the road, so to speak, in our lives, is where glory meets suffering. Where glory intersects with pain. Now it's true, there's a lot of glory in today's gospel lesson. Jesus and 3 of his disciples have gone up on the mountain. He has been transfigured with this bright whiteness, his clothes and his face. The heroes of the faith have shown up to converse with him. God has spoken. He has been confirmed as God's son, the chosen one. The disciples have been told to listen. But then what happens? They come down the mountain. And immediately, just like that, they come face to face with suffering. And the way it's described, I don't know that there's any passage of Scripture that describes suffering in quite these explicit of terms. Let me read that section to you again. This is the Father. Suddenly a spirit seizes him. Remember, he's talking about his only child. And all at once he shrieks. It convulses him until he foams at the mouth. It mauls him and will scarcely leave him. I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not. Those of us among us who have sort of a scientific mind or are in the medical profession might want to say, now, what is the diagnosis of that child's problem? But I'm not sure that's what we're supposed to hear. What we're supposed to hear in those words is the suffering, the fear, how overwhelmed this father and this child are. And I think that's what Jesus hears. And I think that's why he responds with such frustration at his disciples. Because it says in the very beginning of the chapter that we didn't read today that he's given them the ability to overcome all demons and all illness. And yet, for some reason, in this case, they didn't. And these people are suffering. So what happens is that the glory of God in Jesus encounters the destructiveness of the demon. Now remember, when we say demon, we mean it's a symbol for all that is imperfect, all that is hurtful, all that the suffering and pain of the world. And what happens? There's healing. There's astonishment. There's confirmation once again that Jesus is the chosen one. Not only did Jesus shine with brightness, but as the light of God, he brings light to the darkness that is engulfing this man and his son. And their lives are changed. That's what happens when glory intersects with suffering. And we are a part of it. Because our job is to reflect, to be mirrors, to reflect the light of Christ, to reflect his glory in the world. This makes people so nervous. That's because when we look in a mirror at ourselves, we see things that other people probably don't notice, but we see things we don't like. We think, oh gosh, I'm having a bad hair day. Or, I should have ironed that shirt before I came. Or, I sure wish I hadn't sat out in the sun so much. Or, whatever. And yet, what we should see is the fact that we are mirrors reflecting the glory of God. We are mirrors in the world. Let's go over here by these scouts. Reflecting the light of Christ. Let me give you an example of how that happens. A story about a paper boy. Maybe the paper boy was a Cub Scout or a Boy Scout. I don't know. Paper boy's name is Danny. And this is a true story. Danny lived in a warm climate. It was either Las Vegas or Phoenix. I don't remember which one it was. But Danny was delivering the paper. And at this particular house, he had always, seen the woman of the house. And she had always greeted him warmly and, waved. But this particular day, as he was delivering the paper, the man of the house was going in. And he turned around as Danny was delivering the paper and said, I don't want a paper. Why do I need a paper? My wife is dying. Why do I need a paper? Well, Danny was evidently a fairly composed young person because he didn't, get anxious and didn't yell back. Instead, he said to the man, as the man slamming the door, "Do you want my pastor to come and visit you?" That's pretty surprising, don't you think? Well, so the young man, who was a Lutheran in confirmation class, went to his pastor and said, "This man on my paper route is really upset because his wife is sick. And I want to know if you'll go visit him." And the pastor's going, "Oh, yeah, I can just imagine, but what is he going to do?" I mean, the paper boy asked him, Danny asked him specifically to go visit. By the way, I have to add, if you think this is an unlikely story, one of our now deceased members told me that the reason she came to Faith Lutheran Church was because her paper boy invited her. Oh, anyway, Danny asked the pastor, "Would you please go visit this family?" So finally, after a busy week, and the pastor keeps putting it off and putting it off, the pastor's not in the best light in this story, I'm sorry to say. Confirmation class is coming up, and he doesn't want to have to face Danny and say, "I didn't go." So he goes and knocks on the door, and the man opens the door. And he says very quickly, "Your paperboy Danny told me that your wife is ill. I'm a Lutheran pastor, and I want to know if I can offer you any help." The man looked at him and said, "I don't know what a Lutheran is, and I hardly don't know what a pastor is. Leave us alone." And slams the door. But the pastor leaves his card. I knew there was a good reason I have those stacks of business cards in my desk. The pastor leaves his card, thinking, nothing's going to come of this. 3 weeks later, the man calls and says, "My wife wants you to come and visit." So he went, he visited. He walked in, it was a desperate situation. The house was in disarray. The woman was obviously dying, all the medical equipment. The man was more angry than anything. But he went into the wife, and she said, "I'll be honest with you, I have never set foot in a church. And I don't really know what a Lutheran is. But I understand that you people who believe think that God is with you. And I need to have God with me." So, the pastor talked with her. And 2 weeks later, just before her death, she was baptized. She received Holy Communion, in which Jesus is present, we believe. And after that, the story is that she just lit up the room with her smile. That she was a mirror, as Danny had been, of the light of Christ. Well, that's who we are. In various ways, we are mirrors of the light of Christ. Now, we may not do it perfectly, but when your life is engulfed by darkness, a little light is better than no light. So, next time you look in the mirror, don't pick out the gray hair or make a face over how your collar's sticking up. Instead say, "I reflect the light of Christ." And that makes a difference.